Good evening. Good to see you again. Welcome back to the 7th class of this series on a reasonable answer for the hope that we have. I want to go through what we covered last time real quickly. We looked at Jesus as a man, and we found that was really an undeniable historical fact. I'll just run through this real quickly. We looked at some secular writers that were contemporary with Christ, lived in his generation or the following generation or two. And the significance of using these secular writers is that first, they had access to eyewitnesses. And secondly, the references that we used were antagonist or at best neutral and non-Christian sources. They were not friendly witnesses for us. So we could take what they gave us at face value. And thirdly, they cannot be considered bias for Christianity. So anything we established with those witnesses is pretty solid. And those that we used were Thalius, a Samaritan who wrote 19 years after the crucifixion, very soon afterwards. Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian who wrote in the 60s up through about the 80s. He witnessed the sack of Jerusalem in 70. Marba Serapion, a Syrian philosopher who wrote 40 years after the crucifixion. Cornelius Tacitus, a Roman historian. Pliny Secundus, a Roman governor of Bithynia. And Justin Martyr, the lone Christian in the bunch, who was a convertee from Aristotelism and some of the other Greek philosophies, who wrote a treatise in defense of Christianity and addressed it to the Roman Emperor Antonius Pius. And from these, we learn these things about Jesus. His existence as a man in history was established by every one of those. He was widely known for his virtuous life, his teachings, and his wisdom. Pilate's submission to pressure from the Jews to put him to death, his death by crucifixion at Pilate's order. The time and place of the crucifixion, we learn that by the reference to the Roman emperor and to the governor at the time. The piercing of his hands and feet, duly recorded in the Roman archives in the report issued by Pilate to Rome. The casting of lots for his garments from the same source. The darkness from Thalius, who was arguing against Christianity and argued that the darkness was natural, and by doing that gives us the darkness. And his disciples, they reported seeing him alive on the third day, so says Josephus. And some thought him to be the king of the Jews. His history was equal to Socrates, Plato, and Pythagoras before the end of the century, and the existence of many Christians in Rome by 64, enough to be blamed for the burning of Rome, and throughout the empire by AD 112. So that's kind of what we learned about Jesus outside of the Scriptures. F.F. Bruce says some writers may toy with the fancy of a Christ myth, but they do not do so on the grounds of historical evidence. Will Durant, who is not a Christian, he's was a history professor at Columbia University, after 2 centuries of higher criticism, the outlines of the life, character, and teaching of Christ remain reasonably clear and constitute the most fascinating feature in the history of Western man. That's quite an admission for a non-Christian, I think. So we found that Jesus was historical. There's just no credible way of denying that. And those who would deny it, I think, discredit themselves. If he's historical, then he's not mythological. The Bible is not mythology. And he had to be outstanding. Remember, we talked about how you become historical. You don't become historical by being average. And yet we looked at Jesus' resume of things that we know about him, about his physical condition, and they're not very impressive. Born to a simple carpenter, worked for only 3 years, never went more than 100 miles from home in his whole life, never held an office, never conquered anybody, never wrote anything and left his task to a motley band of uninfluential, uneducated men for the most part. Doesn't look like a recipe for changing the world. It's not the way I would think you would go about it. And so we ended up with the question. Will Durant has a way with words, but the question was, what did Jesus do then? None of those things would make him outstanding. Well, none of those things would change the world. And we know that he did. That's a fact. Our names are Jewish names because of Christ. We date our time from his birth. We have cathedrals all over the world and churches. We're here tonight, 2,000 years later, because of him. So he changed the world, no denying it. But what did he do? How did he do it? And in order to answer that, you remember I said that we have to go to the New Testament documents. And so then the question is, are those documents reliable? And that's what we want to start looking at tonight. So tonight we're going to look at the first of two parts, the historical reliability of New Testament documents. And tonight we're going to look at the bibliographical evidence. Now, bibliographical means that it's the way that these documents were transmitted down to us through the ages. I want to look at first at the nature of skepticism and introduce you to a couple of things that will come up again and again. And the first one is the Tübingen theory. It was developed by Professor F.C. Bauer at the University of Tübingen in Germany. It was popularized around 1874. And basically it goes that it pushes the New Testament, the writing of the New Testament documents off into the 2nd and 3rd century. And it does that in order to mythologize Christ. In other words, the scenario it offers is that the New Testament stories about Christ were passed down for many generations orally. And after several generations, when nobody was living any longer who knew Christ, and most of the people that knew those who knew him were also gone, so there's nobody to critique what's said any longer, the stories began to be enhanced and added to and embellished. And slowly, the simple carpenter's son became the Son of God. And after this process was finished, it was all duly recorded, and once it's recorded, of course, it's locked down in place. It can't drift anymore. That's the Tübingen theory. And it's crops up. Most people don't use the name. They don't give Bauer credit for it, but a lot of people use it. People cast doubts on the authorship. Timothy Luke Johnson at Emory University Theological Seminary over in Atlanta. He's the one that says, well, the way we got the Gospels is, Granny has passed on, but we're eating Thanksgiving dinner in her house, and we're eating her recipes, and people start remembering stories about Granny, and somebody else does, and somebody says, we need to write these stories down. And he says, that's the way we got the Gospels. He says, we don't know who Mark was. We don't know who Luke was. Well, I don't know where Timothy Luke Johnson has his head, but it's not in a history book. And I'll show you that tonight. Bart D. Ehrman, who is the head of the School of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, says, as we will see, the gospel writers seem to have inherited their stories about Jesus from a rich oral tradition about him. Because most Christians were pagan converts, it would be worth learning about pagan beliefs to understand how the stories about Jesus might have been modified by Christians who told them. Now, these guys are still working today. You can go buy their lectures on the Teaching Company CDs. And these are the guys that will be teaching kids when they go off to college, or some like them. So I just want you to get an idea of the kind of thing we're opposing in this tonight. Hugh J. Schoenfield is, I think, especially insidious guy. He has a PhD. He claims to have been an interpreter of the Bible. And he says he spent 40 years of study to write a book called The Passover Plot. The Passover Plot. So you can imagine what it's about. He says, taking the Gospels together, we have in them the epitome of the process by which the traditions about Him, that's Jesus, grew and expanded with the changing needs and fortunes of succeeding generations of believers, so that Jesus, as He appears in them, is a composite, remember that word, composite, and somewhat contradictory figure. And we'll look at Hugh J. Schoenfield's work later on. So I want to look at the bibliographical test of historicity tonight. And as I say, that's the process by which the documents came down to us through history. And when a historian finds an ancient document, the first thing you want to know, is it reliable? And is it true? Is it historical? And so they subject it to a series of very straightforward questions that have to be answered regarding the document. And they're things like, who originally recorded the event? Want to know something about the authors. And I'll go into this more as we look at each one. The time lapse between the event and the date it was first recorded. You know, was it recorded right after the event happened when it was fresh in people's mind, or was it recorded 100 years later by somebody going to the archives, and, you know, that would imply it was recorded, wouldn't it? By oral transmission. Was the original record subject to criticism by eyewitnesses? And that's very important, as you can see. The time lapse between the original and the date of the oldest existent copy. So we have two time lapses we're concerned about. The time between the event and when it was first written down. And basically all ancient document originals have vanished. They've been destroyed at some time or other. And so we have copies. And we want to know how old the copy is from which we get our information. Where did this come from? And what was the time lapse between the writing of the original and the time when the copy that we have, the oldest one, the most reliable ones, were made? And the number of existing copies of any significant antiquity. And I'll explain how these are used as we go through, and of course the condition would be important. If they're not readable, they're not very helpful or complete. Okay, so who originally recorded the event? The traditional authors are, as you well know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, James, and Jude. The claims of the writers. We can look easily in the documents and see that the writers claim to be these men. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle. He opens up almost every one of his letters like that. Paul, an apostle. Sending his angel to his servant John. James, a servant of God. Peter, an apostle of Christ. And then we have in John 21, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper. This is the disciple who testifies these things and who wrote them down, which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life, or Jesus. What's John telling us? Where did he get his information? Firsthand. He's an eyewitness, isn't he? You know, I think it's Way TV calls their news eyewitness news, or they used to, you know, because an eyewitness is the very best source of information. You don't want somebody who talked to somebody who talked to somebody who talked to an eyewitness. John says he's an eyewitness. When we told you about the power and coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, Peter says, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Eyewitnesses. We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of the Lord, our Lord, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. We ourselves heard the voice that came from heaven on the sacred mountain, Peter says. Paul says, I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel I preach is not something a man made up. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. So, the writers in the documents claim to be these men. Timothy Luke Johnson and Erdman say we don't know who they are. They obviously don't believe what's written there. So let's look at some external sources. These are men who were early Christians, and they're all related to John, who was the last living apostle, but some of them knew more than John, knew several of the apostles. But Appius, who was bishop of Hierapolis around AD 130, and Polycarp, bishop of Smyrna, were both directly disciples taught by John, the apostle. Irenaeus, bishop of Lyons, was a student of Polycarp, so he's second generation. Ignatius, bishop of Antioch, was a student of Polycarp, but he also met John and some of the other apostles. My point is, these are men who are in a position to know something about the authors of the documents of the New Testament, are they not? And let's see what they say. Matthew compiled the Loga in the Hebrew speech, or Aramaic, and everyone translated them as best he could, Appius. The elder, or John, used to say this also. Mark, having been the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately all that he, Peter, mentioned, not, however, in order. For he was neither a hearer nor a companion of the Lord, but afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter. Again, it's Appius. Remember, he knew John directly. This is from the prologue to the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John was published and given to the churches by John when he was still in the body, or alive, as a man of Hierapolis, Appius by name, John's dear disciple, has related in his exegetical books. Irenaeus says Matthew published his gospel when Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome. Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, himself handed down to us in writing the substance of Peter's preaching. Notice, in writing. In writing. Not told, not passed down orally, but in writing. Luke, the follower of Paul, set down in a book, the gospel preached by his teacher. Then John himself produced his gospel. Matthew published his. All of these are written records, according to Irenaeus, not oral transmissions. And let's look at these men's character. I mean, it's incredible. You know, I don't know how many of us would be willing to die for our faith. You know, I hope I would, but you don't know until you actually face the trial. But these men did. These men did. 86 years, this is what Polycarp said as they captured him and they took him and they tied him to a stake and they put the kindling around his feet and they brought up the torch and they gave him one last chance. They said, to recant. They said, deny Christ and live. And this is what he said. This was his answer. 86 years have I served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I speak evil of my king who saved me? And they lit the torch. I don't know that Dr. Erdman or these other guys have that kind of dedication to what they're saying. I would doubt it. He said, I would rather die for Christ than rule the whole earth. Leave me to the beast, that I may by them be partaker of God. Again, the academic reputation of these men is incredible. Sir William Ramsay says, Luke is a historian first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, he is possessed of the true historic sense. This author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. Let me read you a little bit more. This man's an interesting person. He was a world-renowned archaeologist. He initially believed the Tübingen theory to be true. He went off to Palestine to do some research. And, well, just let me read you what he says. I may fairly claim to have entered this investigation without prejudice in favor of the conclusion which I will now seek to justify. On the contrary, I began with a mind unfavorable to it, for the ingenuity and apparent completeness of the Tübingen theory had at one time quite convinced me. It was gradually borne upon me that in various details the narrative showed marvelous truth. Now he's talking about Luke's writings. In fact, beginning with a fixed idea that the work was essentially a second-century composition and never relying on its evidence as trustworthy for first-century conditions, I gradually came to find it as a useful ally in some obscure and difficult investigations. And then he follows with this statement, which I've abbreviated there. But in other words, in Acts, written by Luke, we have detailed accounts of some of the trips that Paul and his companions took. And he tells us in detail the little towns they went to and the ones they were run out of and where they went to next and so forth. And so if there's towns A, B, and C, and we know about A and C, and nobody's ever found town B, Sir William Ramsay found that if he went there and dug, he found the city. You know, in Acts it says there was a riot at Ephesus, and the whole city went into a riot. They were in the theater. Well, they dug up the amphitheater in Ephesus, and it has a seating capacity of over 40,000. The city could have been there. You know, there were a lot of things like this. I know we'll go into this more next week when we look at some archaeological evidence, but there are a lot of detailed things in Luke, very, very detailed, that impressed William Ramsay. And he was converted to Christianity because of his science. Was there reason for bias among these authors? The claim is that the authors were disciples of Jesus or friends of the disciples, and they were therefore incapable of depicting the true events and the causes behind them. Do you remember, I think it was the second class where we talked about logic, and I told you about some logical fallacies? And one of those fallacies was called argumentum ad hominem circumstantial. It's an argument directed against the individual because of special circumstances, and because of that, without even looking at what he says or evaluating it, you just out of hand dismiss anything the guy says. Remember that? And I think the example I used was if you were going to form an energy policy for the country and you might assign the CEO of Exxon Oil Company to it, and people would say, oh, we can't listen to him, he's got a conflict of interest. Well, this is the same thing. They don't want you to listen to what the apostles said because of their special circumstances of being close to Jesus Christ. It's a logical fallacy, pure and simple. You have to evaluate what the men said. Now, maybe there's a reason to suspect that there was a conflict of interest or some bias, but that's no reason to dismiss something out of hand. You have to evaluate it. And that's what we'll do later on. So, first, is it logically sound? No, it's a logical fallacy. Secondly, is it consistent? Well, you know, In my opinion, this represents ignorance of history. How is history written? Who writes history? If you want to know, for example, the details of D-Day in World War II, you want to know why they selected that day, why did they just select Normandy to go into? There are a lot of things we can find out about D-Day from general information, but if you want to know inside information, details, who do you have to talk to? Who do you have to read? Men like Winston Churchill, Dwight Eisenhower, are people that were on his staff. Those are people that are involved. They have a conflict of interest? Well, we could say that, but how would we find out about the inner workings of the D-Day invasion without going to somebody who was there, who was involved? You can't. You see, history has to be written by those who are either directly involved or very close to the scene and know the people and the circumstances. Nobody else can write it. Or they have to be interviewed. But it has to come directly from them. So this is inconsistent. Normally, eyewitness would be considered good. Now they're saying, no, eyewitness is bad because it's Jesus. See, it's a double standard. Is it historically accurate? Well, I would submit to you that it's not. And if you, for example, take Saul of Tarsus, if you want. And you can look this up in Philippians and Galatians. He tells about his former life as a Jew. Paul was the most militant defender of Judaism of his time. He calls himself a Jew of Jews, a Benjamite. He was a Pharisee. He studied at the feet of Gamaliel. There's nobody of that stature today because it was a combination of the Pope and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. They had their government and religion were tied together, unlike ours. But if you think about it, it would be something like being tutored directly by the Chief Justice of our Supreme Court, if he also had high religious standings. That was quite a thing. He was a national hero. He was defending the faith, the covenant that they had had with God Almighty for some 1,500 years with their people. And he was defending it against this little band of upstart, uneducated, ignorant Galileans. He was a national hero. Saul of Tarsus had everything that men cheat, steal, climb over the top of each other to try to climb up the ladder and achieve. And if you read 2 Corinthians 11, you'll see that he gave all this up gladly when he became a Christian. And not only did he lose these things, but he lived horribly. He was beaten. He was left for dead. He was shipwrecked. He went hungry. He went cold. He goes on and on about the things he suffered willingly. If Saul of Tarsus, Paul, had anything to be biased about, he would be biased, I would think, against Christianity. He certainly began that way. And we'll look at this some more. It's an interesting question, is who possibly could have converted Saul if it wasn't Jesus Christ himself. Okay. So the character of the authors is also testified by external sources. We read these last week. Josephus, Mar-Bar Serapion, Pliny the Younger, and Will Durant all testify to the character of Jesus and or his followers. So the men were of very high character. Okay. Secondly is the time lapse. The second thing we'll look at is the time lapse between the event and the date it was recorded. And it's obvious why this is important. This is the basic assumption that the Tübingen theory uses, that this was a long time. And it has to be, because you can't be deified in your own generation. You know, if I tried to tell you I'm God, my wife back here would stand up and refute that, because she knows all of my flaws and my short temper and my lack of patience and all these things that my clay feet consist of. And that's true of anybody. You have to be dead a long time, and people don't know you before you can be deified, and that's the whole premise of the Tübingen theory. That's why he pushes these documents out into the 2nd, 3rd century before they're written down. So let's look at it. Who were the authors? Well, we found out they were Matthew, Mark, Luke, all these guys. And who were they? Companions of Christ or companions of those companions. They were all contemporaries of Christ. It's not possible that these men wrote anything in the 2nd or 3rd century, is it? Sir William Ramsay, as I told you a while ago, he was converted to Christianity because his research showed that these documents had such incredible accuracy that he was convinced that they could have never been products of the 2nd or 3rd century. They had to be written in the 1st century. And he, a skeptic, was converted on that basis. So here are the dates that are virtually uncontested today, and therefore the Tübingen theory, which will crop up again and again, interestingly enough, has been discredited. Paul's letters began to be written in 51 and through about 62 AD. Remember, the event was 33 AD. Mark was written somewhere between 64 and 70. The number in brackets is F.F. Bruce's best estimate. Matthew, somewhere between 80 and 85. Luke, between 80 and 85. Acts, somewhere between 64 and 85. And the last book to be written was John's Gospel, sometime around 90 to 100. Some scholars say there's no basis at all for assuming any of these documents were written any later than 80 or 85. But the point is, they were all written before the close of the 1st century. They were all written within the lifetimes of eyewitnesses. So, the next question is, was the original record critiqued by eyewitnesses? Well, it certainly was possible. They could have been available to them. The question is, were they? And first we'll look in the documents to see what they say. And it's obvious that it was, and we look at the effect on the eyewitnesses when they are told these things. Therefore, Peter says in Acts 2, when he's confronting the crowd of Jews, some of which were part of the crucifying mob, he says, "Therefore let all Israel be assured of this, God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ." And when the people heard this, they were cut to the heart and said to Peter and the other apostles, "Brothers, what shall we do?" So according to this, yes, it was available to eyewitnesses, those who had witnessed Christ. And that's the effect it had on them. But many who heard the message believed, and the number of men grew to about 5,000. So a lot of people converted. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual to the Jewish synagogue. A great number of Jews and Gentiles believed. This is still within the generation. Oops, well, I don't know how to go back. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. This is Josephus. This is not in the Bible. So if you want to say, well, we're using the book that we're trying to validate itself, okay, but these are not from the Bible. These are external sources. Many Christians in Rome in the reign of Nero, as proven by Cornelius Tacitus, when he wrote about the fact that they were blamed for the burning of Rome. And many Christians in Bithynia by AD 112, by Pliny the Younger, when he wrote the letter to the emperor asking if he had to put all Christians to death or just certain ones. Now, if there'd been no Christ, and if there'd been no documentation, and if the people hadn't known what's written, they would not have converted. You see, if you're asked to risk your life for a belief, and somebody writes down what that belief is, and you get it, and you read it, and you know it's bogus, you're not going to risk your life. These people died for what they believed. So many of them that the governor of Bithynia wrote a letter to the emperor. Okay, time lapse between the original manuscript and the date of the oldest existing copy. So now we want to know, okay, things didn't go along orally for generations. They were written in the same generation as Christ. But how did we get it? Because the originals are no longer with us. And so it would be nice if we knew that our Bible is produced from a copy of the original, rather than a copy of 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 the original. It'd be better to have a copy of the original, right? But unfortunately, copies don't say this is a first generation copy or this is a 10th generation copy. They don't tell you that. So what do we do about that? Well, we look at the time lapse. If a copy was made within 30, 40, 50 years of the original, it might have been copied from the original. Certainly from a copy of the original, no more. But if it was made 1,000 years after the original, then it has to be many generations of copies in between there, because they just didn't last that long. Okay? So that's the principle here. And so I want to look at this. So here, and this is not a catalog of everything by any means, but here there are two types of documents we want to look at. Those called fragments and those called codices. Fragments are what you would think. They may be part of a gospel, say part of John, maybe most of John. Or it might be part of what we have now as a verse. Might be a few words, fragments. They can be anything in there. Codices are books that contain basically the whole New Testament and some of them the whole Bible. So here are the three of the main fragments. The John Ryland manuscript was made 40 years after John wrote his gospel. 40 years. It was found in Egypt, not in Palestine, in Egypt. So it's interesting in it because, they didn't have Xerox machines back there. It was a lot of work to make copies of things, and things generally were not copied unless they were important. And this tells us that it was copied and it was widely distributed into a different continent within 40 years. It certainly tells you that John's gospel was produced. This was produced around 130 or so. John's gospel had to be produced back in the first century for this to happen. Chester Beatty papyri were produced about 110 years after the close of the New Testament. In other words, after about 90 AD. And it contains most of the New Testament within 110 years. The Bodmer papyri 2, 60 to 110 years, contain most of John. Now those are the main fragments. And we'll put these dates in context in a minute. Here are the codices, the main ones. You can see the span time between the originals and when these were made. Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are two of the oldest, around 230 to 250, 60 years. Alexandrinus is 310, Ephremi 310, Bizet 360. Interesting, it's a bilingual book in Syriac and Greek and so forth. So those are some of the older sources from which our Bible is made. Just for fun, here are some classical works whose authenticity is unquestioned. And I brought a show and tell tonight. These are two books I had to read in school. This is Sophocles, the Theban Plays. And this is Great Dialogues of Plato. It contains several of his books. Now, I have to tell you that when I studied this, nobody suggested that Plato might be a composite. That maybe somebody wrote the Apology and somebody else wrote the Republic, and they just got all put together and they pinned it on this pen name of Plato. That didn't come up. And I'm not going to suggest it because we can't prove or disprove that, and there's no reason to think that this is not the work of Plato. But neither is there any reason to question these other things of the Bible. I mean, it's the same thing. Nobody either asked, well, are these actually the writings of Plato? Is this an accurate representation of what he wrote? Nobody asked that. Nobody even thought about how we got this, or how long it was between when Plato wrote his writings and when the copy from which this comes from was made. But look up here. Sophocles, this one, 1,400 years. Impeccable. Nobody questions it. Plato, 1,200 years. Impeccable. Nobody questions it. Nobody. How many copies do you suppose occurred in 1,400 years, or 1,200 years, or 1,000 years? Aristotle, 1,400 years. Julius Caesar, 1,000 years. Tacitus, who we quoted a while ago, 1,000 years. Livy, 300. It's the only one that's even close to the biblical sources. Pliny was 750 years, Pliny Secundus. The next thing we're going to look at is the number of copies. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because when you have copies, you inevitably have some scribal errors. How do you get rid of scribal errors? Well, if you have one copy, and that's all you've got, what you see is what you get. You can't do anything. If there's an error there, it's there, period. But if you have a lot of copies, then you can let them vote, so to speak. And that's what this diagram shows. Down at the bottom, you have the existing manuscripts. And they're all alike except for 4C. It has a change in it. So it tracks back up to another generation where the change occurred, and then above that it didn't occur. But you can get rid of that by saying, okay, if all these other copies that came from different sources say one thing and 4C says something different, 4C probably is a scribal error. And so that's the process historians go through to clear out errors. And so it's important to have, whether you have one copy or 5 or 6 copies or 10,000 copies. So let's look at what we have. By the way, another point that comes into play is very early, the New Testament, which was written mostly in Greek, partially in Syriac, was translated into other languages. And so we have a lot of existing Greek manuscripts coming from the original Greek. But we also have the Syriac translation that was translated around 150 to 250 AD. And we have the Latin translation around 300 to 400 AD. And from each of those, we have a lot of copies. In fact, more than 9,000 copies of those early translations. So let's look at the copies. Now, I introduced you a while ago to the Codices, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and so forth. And so there are 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of those. But the Syriac Peshitta, 350 copies. The Latin Vulgate, 8,000 copies. The early Greek manuscripts, more than 4,000 copies. Other early translations, more than 1,000. Altogether, we have more than 13,000 very old, very reliable, good sources for the Bible that we can compare with each other to remove errors. And that's why when you go back and you find old documents, you don't find much difference. Let's look at the secular things. Before I go there, in addition to copies, the early church fathers wrote each other, and they discussed issues and dogma and such things, and so they quoted the New Testament when they wrote. And that's a list of those guys and the areas in which they made their quotes, but white number down at the bottom is I want you to remember. 36,000 quotations and letters written. These are external to the Scriptures, quoting the Scriptures. In the New Testament, if we had no copy at all of the Bible, we could reproduce the New Testament from all these quotations perfectly. I'm telling you, this thing is unbelievably historically accurate. Let's compare that with the classics. Sophocles, the oldest, there are 100 copies, that's all, the oldest of which was made 1,400 years after the original. Plato, there are only 7 copies of Plato. So this book, if they wanted to get out errors, they had 7 copies, that's all. And the oldest of those 7 was 1,200 years after Plato wrote. Tacitus, 7 copies, the oldest of which is 1,000 years after the original. Pliny the Younger, 7 copies, 750 years after the oldest one. And you can see the rest of them up there. The point is, you apply these bibliographical tests, which are the standard academic test, and we just apply these cold, hard tests to the Scriptures. We don't hold back. And it's literally thousands of times better than anything else from ancient history. Literally thousands of times better. Here's what modern historians say. The New Testament has about 20,000 lines of text. Only 40 lines, or about 400 words of the New Testament, are in doubt. 1/2 of 1%. Most of these variations are merely mechanical matters such as spelling or style. Only 1/60th rise above trivialities. No fundamental doctrine of Christian faith rests on a disputable reading. So out of those few things that are disputable, we don't have any real doctrine that rests on them. It cannot be too strongly asserted that in substance the text of the Bible is certain. Sir Frederick Kenyon, Director of the British Museum. The number of manuscripts of the New Testament, of early translations from it, of the quotations from the oldest writers of the church, which we just looked at all of that, is so large that it's practically certain that the true reading is preserved. This can be said of no other ancient book in the world. Again, Frederick Kenyon, British Museum Director. Okay, what about the conditions of the copies that we have? And this is interesting. If we look at the New Testament, there are 27 books and we have 27. And we have 13,000 copies of those and so forth and so on. We have all those citations. We have fragments that go back within a few years of the originals being written. Tacitus. His histories consisted of 14 books. Of those 14, only 4.5 have survived down to the present day. Of his annals, 16 books, only 10, plus a partial one, exist today. Livy, and these are guys from which we know about the Roman Empire. Livy wrote 142 books of his histories. Only 35 have survived down through time. You know, if this is the Word of God, if there's a God and this is His Word and He's all-powerful, you would think that He would make sure that His Word was recorded in an impeccable way, that it would be the most reliable thing that we have. And what do we see? Modern historians, real quickly. Will Durant says, higher criticism has applied to the New Testament test of authenticity so severe that by them 100 ancient worthies, such as Hammurabi, David, and Socrates, would fade into legend. And I think you see why he said that, because we just looked at the evidence for Socrates and Hammurabi and those guys. Okay, I don't have to read that. He also says that a few simple men should in one generation have invented so powerful and appealing a personality, so lofty an ethic, so inspiring a vision of human brotherhood would be a miracle far more incredible than any recorded in the Gospels. This man's not a Christian. So our conclusions. If the New Testament documents are not history, then we don't have any history. Because it's literally thousands of times more reliable than anything else you can put your hand on. Literally. If you throw it out, that's what Durant just said. Why would a non-Christian insist on the historicity of this book here? Well, he just admitted, if he throws this out go 100 others. Because nothing compares with it. He has to accept this as a historian, even though he's not a Christian. And he does, to his credit. Now, he has a little problem, and we may have time to get into that, but nevertheless, that's what he says. So, we don't have any history if that's not history. And if Jesus is not historical, then neither are 100 other ancients whose existence is unquestioned and whose writings are unquestioned. So these guys like Ehrman and so forth that ask these silly questions, it's a way of spinning things, you know. They don't tell you all the facts. They ignore a lot of historical facts that they obviously know, but they don't tell. I think they're academically dishonest. Unfortunately, they're teaching our kids. Next week, we'll go to part 2 of the historical reliability of the New Testament. We'll look at the external evidence, and what I mean by that are things that are not really directly associated with this, but things that confirm it. We will compare things in here with the writings of people like Tacitus and Flavius Josephus, and we'll also look at archaeological evidence, things that have turned up from archaeological digs that confirm what's written in the New Testament. It's very important that we establish the historicity of the New Testament, because the two things that are most often attacked initially are the historical Jesus. If you can get rid of him, you don't worry about anything else. Or the historicity of the Bible. If you can do away with that, then you can interpret it any way you want, and you can go anywhere you want to, which is what the Passover plot does. And then thirdly, they attack the resurrection. So we'll look at the historical evidence and the archaeological evidence next week. I appreciate you coming, and I hope you can come back next week.
Let me have your attention just a moment. I've got 2 announcements.
I got a question.